A successful, independent 65-year-old woman thought she had found love. For Sophie, the weight of decades spent building an empire, chasing career achievements and raising a family left a hollow space in her life, a space she hoped a new love could fill. But what happened next would shatter everything she had worked for, everything she believed about herself, and the very foundation of her carefully constructed life. This is a story about manipulation, vulnerability, and murder, but it's not just about what happened, it's about how it all could have been avoided, how one decision, one misstep, led to a tragic, irreversible end. Sophie's story is one of trusting too deeply, of believing in someone who was never who they appeared to be. Could love really turn into something so dark and deadly? Could trust be twisted so thoroughly that it led to murder? This is a journey through a web of deceit and betrayal, and it starts with Sophie, the woman who thought she could never be deceived until she met him. Sophie lived a life many could only dream of, financially independent, respected in her field, and surrounded by a legacy of hard work and success. At 65, she had built an empire, a testament to decades of sacrifice and ambition. But despite the wealth and accolades, Sophie found herself facing a deep, aching loneliness. Her children had their own families, and her friends had moved on with their lives. Retirement, which once seemed like a well-deserved reward, now felt like a quiet, empty void. In her large, echoing home, Sophie's accomplishments seemed hollow without someone to share them with. That's when Cole Rodriguez entered her life. At 27, Cole was everything Sophie never thought she would want. A younger man with an air of youthful confidence, a sharp wit, and a presence that seemed to fill the room. He appeared to offer Sophie the companionship and warmth she had long craved. In a world where her peers were settling into quieter, more isolated lives, Cole represented something completely different: excitement, passion, and the promise of a new chapter. Sophie's initial reservations about dating someone so much younger were quickly dissolved by his charm and attention. For the first time in years, she felt truly desired. But their relationship, which seemed so perfect on the surface, was not built on love. It was built on manipulation. Cole, well aware of Sophie's vulnerabilities, knew exactly how to play his part. He showered her with affection, made her feel special, and slowly, subtly, took control of her life. What Sophie saw as a romantic fairy tale was actually a carefully orchestrated performance, designed to make her trust him completely. Cole knew how to read Sophie's insecurities and play on them. He'd whisper sweet nothings in her ear, tell her how much she meant to him, and in the same breath subtly undermine her decisions, isolating her from the very people who had once been her support system. Over time, Sophie's once steady confidence began to erode. Friends noticed the change. Her children became concerned when they saw Sophie distancing herself from them, and the man she had once dismissed as a mere flirtation began to take up more and more space in her life. The relationship that once felt like a rejuvenation of Sophie's spirit was, in reality, a carefully crafted web of control. Cole used his charm to disarm, to deceive, and to manipulate, and as his hold over her tightened, Sophie couldn't see the danger that was creeping closer. She was blinded by the love she thought she had found. Then came the night that would change everything. Sophie, in her vulnerability and trust, found herself in a position no one could have predicted. One night, in the comfort of her home, she was found dead. The police investigation would soon unravel a devastating truth. Sophie's death was no accident. Cole, her 27-year-old husband, became the prime suspect. The tragedy was not just about Sophie's untimely death, but about how her trust had been so completely broken. Sophie had been manipulated to the point of no return. The very man who had promised her companionship, who had filled her heart with hope, was the one who took everything away from her. He was the one who took her life. The crime was shocking, not only for its brutality, but for how it had been set into motion by the very person who should have been Sophie's protector. And as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't just a case of murder. It was a story of control, of emotional vulnerability twisted into something much darker. Cole had found a way to weave himself into Sophie's life, and in doing so, he had manipulated her trust, isolated her from those who could have helped, and ultimately ended. Sophie had spent most of her life living on her own terms. A self-made woman, her success wasn't handed to her. It was earned through hard work, dedication, and sheer resilience. For decades, she had been a force to be reckoned with in the business world, carving out a niche for herself that few could rival. She built an empire, raised children, and weathered the storms of 2 failed marriages. But beneath the surface of this strong, independent woman was a heart that longed for connection, for something more than just financial success. Despite the wealth and independence she had accumulated, Sophie's personal life had been marked by disappointment. Her marriages had ended in heartbreak, and while she adored her children, their busy lives left her feeling disconnected. As she entered her retirement years, Sophie found herself in a strange and unfamiliar place: an empty house, quiet holidays, and long, lonely days. Financial security had never been an issue, but companionship, the kind that filled the spaces between the mundane moments of life, was something Sophie desperately yearned for. Her story was one of love and loss, and with each passing year, the ache of loneliness grew louder. The career that had once defined her now seemed secondary. Retirement, which many would envy, felt like a quiet death of sorts. Sophie craved affection, intimacy, and someone to share her days with, but the idea of dating again was daunting, especially given the bitter taste left by her previous marriages. She had no interest in younger men, who she feared would only want her for her wealth, her status, or the idea of what she could provide. Yet, as time went on, Sophie's vulnerability grew. She wasn't looking for a rebound or a fling, she was looking for something real, something that could fill the void in her heart. Cole Rodriguez seemed to be everything Sophie wasn't expecting, but everything she had come to desire. Tall, handsome, and brimming with youthful confidence, Cole appeared to be a breath of fresh air in Sophie's life. He had the energy of a man half his age, the charm of someone who knew exactly how to captivate a room. His attention was relentless, his compliments effusive, and his affection all-encompassing. He made Sophie feel like she was the center of his world. In him she saw someone who understood her, someone who could appreciate her accomplishments and share in the loneliness that plagued her. Cole quickly slipped into Sophie's life. He became her confidant, her lover, her closest companion. He appeared to genuinely care about her, showering her with thoughtful gestures, sweet words, and intimate moments. Sophie, in her yearning for love and affection, couldn't help but be drawn in by him. He made her feel special again, like she was worthy of attention and passion. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. But as the relationship deepened, the cracks began to show. At first they were subtle. Cole would gently suggest that Sophie avoid seeing her friends or family, claiming that he wanted her all to himself. He would downplay her successes, offering quiet criticisms disguised as concern. "Maybe you should take it easy," he'd say, or, "It's probably time for you to slow down, don't you think?" Sophie, ever the ambitious woman, tried to brush off these comments. After all, Cole was younger and his lifestyle and expectations were different from hers. But with each passing day, his influence grew stronger. He slowly, steadily began to isolate her from her world, the one she had built before he entered her life. Despite the outward perfection of their relationship, there were unsettling moments that Sophie chose to ignore. Cole's possessiveness, masked by affection, began to show itself in ways that weren't immediately obvious. He would become upset when Sophie made plans that didn't involve him, questioning why she would need to leave him alone. He would make snide comments about her interactions with others, subtly casting doubt on her friends, making her feel as if they were the ones pulling her away from him. Behind his charming exterior, Cole had a history that Sophie didn't fully understand. He had used his charm to manipulate other women in the past, women who had seen the signs too late. His relationships were built on a foundation of emotional control, and he was skilled at disguising his intentions. He wasn't working towards a partnership, he was working towards domination. His financial dependence on Sophie was a part of the plan, a means of entangling her further in his life. Sophie, out of kindness and her own need for affection, allowed him to take more and more control both emotionally and financially. But behind Cole's polished smile there was a darker side, a side that Sophie could never have anticipated. She was too blinded by her need for love, too enamored by the attention he lavished on her, to see the signs. His manipulation went unnoticed, his controlling behavior brushed aside in favor of the fleeting moments of happiness he gave her. The very thing Sophie once took pride in, her independence, her career, and her relationships, were now seen as obstacles to Cole, and he was determined to make her believe they weren't necessary, that only he mattered. At first, Sophie thought Cole's demands were a sign of love. She thought he was just being protective, that he wanted to spend time with her because he cared. But in truth, this was all part of a carefully orchestrated plan to keep Sophie isolated, to keep her dependent on him. And with each passing day, Cole's hold on Sophie grew stronger. But behind his charm, Cole had a darker side, one Sophie didn't see coming. As the relationship progressed, it became clear that Cole wasn't just interested in Sophie's affection. He wanted complete control. His manipulation had worked its way into every corner of her life, and Sophie, though she could sense something was wrong, didn't know how to break free. She had been so consumed by the illusion of love that she couldn't recognize the truth until it was too late. Sophie's tragic fate was sealed not by a single event, but by a series of subtle, dangerous steps that no one saw coming, not even Sophie. And with each decision, each day that passed, the inevitable end drew nearer. Cole had already planned his escape, and Sophie was none the wiser. In the beginning, Cole's presence in Sophie's life was like a breath of fresh air. The honeymoon phase of their relationship felt like a dream, a whirlwind of romance, affection, and attention. Sophie, after years of solitude and disappointment, couldn't help but be swept away by the intensity of Cole's affection. He was everything she had hoped for, a man who showered her with compliments, made her feel beautiful, and seemed to hang on her every word. For the first time in years, Sophie felt seen, valued, and loved. She believed that Cole was the answer to the loneliness that had haunted her for so long. Their days were filled with long conversations, romantic dinners, and spontaneous adventures. Cole would surprise her with flowers, handwritten notes, and promises of a future together. Sophie couldn't help but feel that this time, perhaps, she had finally found true love, the kind she had longed for but never thought would come. The connection between them seemed undeniable, and Sophie felt an overwhelming sense of relief that she was no longer alone. But as the months passed, the mask began to slip, and Cole's behavior started to shift subtly at first, so gradually that Sophie didn't notice the changes. His affection began to feel less like genuine love and more like a tool to control her. At first it was small things, comments about how Sophie should dress, subtle remarks about the people she spent time with, or suggestions about how she should spend her money. Cole would say things like, "You deserve better than them," referring to her friends, or "Wouldn't you rather spend time with me than with your kids?" Sophie, still caught up in the euphoria of their relationship, shrugged off these remarks, thinking they were just the thoughts of a man who loved her deeply, a man who wanted nothing more than to be by her side. But over time the manipulation became more evident. Cole's once constant attention now began to feel possessive. He would make comments that subtly undermined Sophie's self-esteem. "Are you sure you can trust them? Or do you really think they have your best interests at heart?" These comments, wrapped in the guise of concern, slowly began to erode Sophie's confidence in herself and in her closest relationships. Her friends and family began to notice, but Sophie, blinded by her dependence on Cole's affection, refused to see the truth. Every time they raised concerns, Sophie would brush them off, telling herself that Cole only wanted to protect her, to be the partner she had always dreamed of. As Cole's control grew stronger, Sophie's independence began to slip away. He convinced her that her career wasn't as important as spending time with him, and slowly Sophie began to distance herself from the business she had worked so hard to build. Her colleagues saw less and less of her, and her children too became concerned. Sophie ignored their calls more often, choosing instead to indulge in Cole's world, one where he made the rules and she followed. But it wasn't just Sophie's time that Cole sought to control, it was her every decision. He started influencing her spending habits, telling her that certain purchases were unnecessary or a waste, while slowly suggesting things that only benefited him. He made her feel guilty for questioning him, even in the smallest of matters. "I only want what's best for you," he would say, framing every decision as an act of love. Slowly, Sophie began to second-guess herself, no longer trusting her instincts, but instead leaning on Cole for guidance. Despite the growing concerns from her family, Sophie continued to defend Cole. She was so deeply invested in the relationship that she couldn't or wouldn't see the red flags. The moments of tension between them became more frequent, but they were always followed by grand gestures or emotional apologies. Cole was good at playing the part of the remorseful lover, pulling Sophie back into his web each time she began to question him. He knew exactly how to manipulate her emotions, how to make her feel guilty for even thinking of leaving him. By now, Sophie's life revolved almost entirely around Cole. Her once thriving social circles were shrinking, her children's visits were less frequent, and her career was taking a backseat to a man who seemed to want nothing more than to absorb her whole world. It was becoming harder for Sophie to see where she ended and where Cole began. But each day Sophie felt herself slipping deeper into Cole's world, unaware of the trap being set. The man she had once believed to be her savior was now her captor, and the hold he had on her was tightening with every passing day. The manipulation, the isolation, and the emotional control had already taken root, and Sophie was too entangled in the illusion of love to break free. As her world became smaller, so did her understanding of what was truly happening around her. Sophie's life had become a reflection of the very thing she had been running from, loneliness, but now she was trapped in a different kind of solitude, one that no amount of affection could fill. Cole had slowly and quietly become the center of Sophie's existence, and she in turn had become the perfect pawn in his twisted game. The night of Sophie's death was eerily quiet, just like so many others that had come before it. In the expansive silence of her home, a place once filled with the hum of her business calls and the laughter of her children, Sophie prepared for another evening alone with Cole. The house, despite its size and grandeur, felt more like a prison now. The walls, once a reflection of her success and independence, had become a cage he never realized she had willingly entered. On that particular evening, Sophie had spent the day with Cole, the two of them preparing a simple dinner together. They were in their routine, an ever-growing pattern of dependency and control that Sophie, to her dismay, couldn't escape. Cole had become more distant over the last few weeks, but she didn't know why. He had become more irritable, more short with her, and though she noticed, she chose to ignore the signs. There was always an excuse. He was stressed about money, he was frustrated with his own career. The thought that Cole might be losing interest, or worse, had become a mere passing thought, quickly dismissed in favor of the comfort his affection still brought her.
But tonight Sophie felt a strange sense of unease. Something was different. Something in the air felt off. As she stirred the pot on the stove, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not by a loving partner, but by someone whose intentions had shifted. She glanced at Cole, who stood by the kitchen counter, eyes fixed on his phone. He wasn't paying attention to her, but there was a tension in his posture that made her heart race. She smiled at him, trying to push the thought away, but the knot in her stomach wouldn't loosen. Later that evening, as they sat down for dinner, Sophie's mind kept drifting. She remembered a conversation she had had earlier with her daughter. A conversation about visiting her over the weekend. It had been a long time since she had seen her children, and she had made plans to spend the next few days with them. Sophie felt a sense of relief at the thought. A quiet joy, knowing that maybe, just maybe, she could escape the quiet hold Cole had on her. Even if only for a few days.
But Cole's mood had shifted dramatically. His voice was colder, sharper. "You really want to go?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. Sophie, sensing the subtle shift, shrugged. "Of course, I miss them," she replied, trying to keep the conversation light. But Cole didn't drop the subject. "They don't need you. They've moved on. They're busy with their own lives." His words stung, but Sophie dismissed it, trying to laugh it off. "I'm still their mother, Cole." That's when the atmosphere in the room changed. Cole's eyes, once warm and filled with affection, grew cold. "You know," he said, his voice taking on an eerily calm tone, "sometimes I wonder if they really appreciate you, if they really care." Sophie froze, feeling an icy chill crawl down her spine. Cole's gaze didn't waver, and for the first time in months, she could see a glint in his eyes, a look she hadn't noticed before, but now understood all too well. It wasn't love, it wasn't affection, it was something far darker. But Sophie, in her heart, still trusted Cole, never imagining what he was capable of. As the evening wore on, Sophie became more aware of the changes in Cole's behavior. He was no longer the charming, loving man she had fallen for. He had become someone else entirely, someone controlling, someone dangerous. Sophie, in her vulnerability and desire to believe in the good of the man she had loved, convinced herself it was just a phase, that the stress of their relationship, the isolation, had worn him down. But something in her gut told her to be wary, told her that something was wrong. She didn't know it yet, but that night would be her last. The details of what happened next were pieced together later, but Sophie's final moments were filled with confusion and fear. It's believed that Cole had been planning this for days, if not weeks. He had been patient, letting the tension build until he could control her completely. He knew exactly how to wear Sophie down, how to push her to the edge without her ever suspecting his true intentions. The method of Sophie's murder was calculated, cold, and ruthless. Sophie had poured herself a glass of wine as they continued to talk. She had been feeling increasingly unwell that evening, a dizziness that seemed to wash over her in waves. At first she chalked it up to the long day and stress, but soon the nausea became impossible to ignore. Her head swam, her vision blurred. She stumbled slightly as she stood up to go to the bathroom. "Are you okay?" Cole asked, his voice deceptively concerned. But Sophie couldn't answer. She could barely keep her balance. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed into the kitchen chair. Her last thought, before the world went black, was a faint question. "Why do I feel so sick?" Cole, in his cold and calculated manner, had poisoned her wine, something he had prepared days earlier, waiting for the right moment. The slow-acting toxin was designed to incapacitate Sophie without her knowing what was happening. By the time she realized she was too ill to move, it was too late. Sophie's breath became shallow, her pulse weakened. She struggled to keep her eyes open, her mind fogged with confusion. But Cole was there, by her side, watching her slip away. Sophie, despite the dizziness clouding her senses, never saw the final blow coming. She still trusted Cole. She never imagined he was capable of murder. But the plan Cole had set in motion would change everything. Sophie's final moments were filled with the eerie silence of the house she once filled with laughter, as the man she trusted most stood by, watching her life slip away. The man who had once been her savior was now her executioner. And when Sophie's body was finally found, it was a cruel revelation of how deep the manipulation had gone, how Cole had carefully orchestrated the events leading to her death. He had spent months building a facade of love, a facade that masked his true intentions. But now, Sophie's life was over, and the lies that had sustained their relationship began to unravel, piece by piece. Cole had taken everything from Sophie, and as her life faded, he was already planning his next move. Sophie never saw it coming. When Sophie's body was discovered, it sent shockwaves through her family. It was her daughter who first raised alarm when Sophie didn't show up for their weekend plans. She'd called and texted multiple times, but there was no response. By that evening, worry turned into panic, and the family contacted the local authorities to conduct a welfare check. The officers arrived at Sophie's home to find it eerily quiet, the door unlocked, as if no one had expected any visitors. Inside, everything appeared to be in place, except for Sophie. Her body was discovered slumped in the kitchen, her once vibrant face pale and twisted in confusion. There were no immediate signs of physical violence, but the dizziness Sophie had complained of earlier raised immediate suspicion. The first assumption was natural causes, maybe an accident, a sudden illness, but it was too early to rule out anything. As the authorities began their initial investigation, Sophie's family was informed. The news was devastating, and her children were left grappling with disbelief. They hadn't been able to reach her, and now Sophie was gone. Her son, in particular, was struck with confusion and anger. He had spent years trying to get closer to his mother, but her increasing isolation and her relationship with Cole had made it difficult. There was no way to prepare for something like this. Sophie's children were in shock, not just from the loss, but from the overwhelming confusion surrounding her death. Their mother had been perfectly healthy, or so they had thought. Her sudden, unexplained death didn't make sense. Her son pushed the investigators harder, asking questions no one had considered. "Who was with her?" he demanded. "What happened? Was she alone?" Initially, no one suspected Cole. He was devastated, or at least he appeared to be. He played the role of the grieving husband perfectly, publicly mourning the loss of the woman he had married. He insisted that Sophie had been battling a sudden undiagnosed illness, something that had taken her by surprise. His story was consistent, too consistent. He claimed to have been with Sophie all day, telling investigators that they had shared a quiet evening together before she suddenly grew ill. He even suggested that the cause might have been food poisoning, playing the part of a concerned, helpless spouse. However, as investigators dug deeper, a different picture began to emerge, one that was far less innocent. It wasn't long before contradictions started to surface. Despite his story, Cole had no plausible explanation for why Sophie's phone was found in another room, left behind as if she had been in a hurry. Why had she moved from the kitchen table to the chair by the door? Was it an attempt to reach the phone, or was she trying to escape from someone? The police noted his odd detachment, a coldness in his demeanor that didn't match his claims of grief. In interviews, Cole appeared calm, almost rehearsed. Too rehearsed for someone who had just lost their spouse. His emotions seemed too controlled, his words too measured. The more they looked into Cole's background, the more disturbing details began to surface. Interviews with friends and family members painted a portrait of a man who had always been charming on the surface, but whose relationships were consistently marked by manipulation and control. He had a history of manipulating older women, using their emotions, isolating them from their families, and draining them financially. One ex-girlfriend even came forward, revealing that Cole had previously been involved in an abusive relationship, one that ended under suspicious circumstances. Police dug into Sophie's financial records next. It was here that they found the first concrete piece of evidence pointing to Cole's true intentions. Sophie, always careful with her finances, had begun making large, unexplained transfers to Cole's bank account just weeks before her death. The amounts weren't huge, but they were consistent. Sophie had started spending money on things Cole suggested, things that benefited him directly, but not her. She had even begun withdrawing cash and making purchases that didn't seem to fit with her usual frugal habits. Sophie's children had noticed this, two small shifts in her behavior, that they had chalked up to her growing affection for Cole. But as investigators combed through the transactions, it became clear that Cole had been manipulating her into making these transfers. He had been feeding her lies about their future together, convincing her that the money was necessary to build their life, to prepare for a shared future. But it was all part of the plan. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became Sophie's death had not been an accident. It had been a calculated murder. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Cole had been in debt, serious debt that he had hidden from Sophie. He had been relying on her wealth to fund his lifestyle, and when that wasn't enough, he began manipulating Sophie to drain her savings. He had even convinced her to reallocate some of her business assets, promising her that they would invest together for a brighter future. Cole's behavior was finally starting to make sense. His charm had been a mask for his financial desperation, and his emotional manipulation was designed to keep Sophie isolated and vulnerable. Then came the twist. Cole's history wasn't as clean as he had made it seem. Investigators uncovered a string of broken relationships, each one marked by similar patterns of manipulation, control, and financial gain. One ex-partner had suffered a mysterious accident, a fall that resulted in a broken arm. The story she told was eerily similar to Sophie's. The investigators were beginning to see a pattern. Cole's relationships always followed the same trajectory, and they always ended in the woman's financial ruin, or worse. Sophie had been no different. As Cole's manipulations deepened, Sophie had become more isolated, more dependent on him, and when Sophie's money ran out, Cole turned to the one thing he had been planning all along: her life. The police now had a clearer picture of who Cole really was, a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. But as the evidence piled up, one question remained. Was he just a master manipulator, or was there something even darker behind his carefully crafted persona? The investigation was far from over, but the emotional toll on Sophie's family was already immense. They had lost not just a mother, but a woman who had worked tirelessly for everything she had. They had lost her to a man who never cared for her at all. The investigation into Sophie's death culminated in a shocking but inevitable conclusion. Cole Rodriguez was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, as well as financial fraud and abuse. As the evidence against him mounted his manipulative behavior, the financial records showing how he drained Sophie's savings, and the disturbing history of his relationships, it became clear that this was no tragic accident. It was cold-blooded murder, planned and executed by a man who had used charm and deceit to manipulate his way into Sophie's life. The news of his arrest reverberated through the community, but for Sophie's family it was a bitter pill to swallow. They had trusted Cole, welcomed him into their mother's life, and had no idea that the man they saw as a loving partner was anything but. His betrayal cut deep. Sophie's children struggled with the fact that they had missed the warning signs, believing in the man who had portrayed himself as the perfect partner for their mother. The court proceedings were long and intense. Sophie's family, though devastated, took the stand as key witnesses in the trial, and their pain was palpable. The courtroom was filled with tension as Cole's defense team tried to paint a different picture of him, one of a man who had been in love, a man who had simply been misunderstood. They claimed that Sophie's death was a tragic accident, brought on by her own health issues and stress. They tried to portray Cole as a grieving husband who had been devastated by her sudden death. But the evidence was overwhelming. Cole's calm demeanor in the courtroom contrasted sharply with the grief-stricken faces of Sophie's family. As the trial continued, Cole never once showed genuine remorse. He maintained his innocence, denying any involvement in Sophie's death, even in the face of damning evidence. His behavior in court remained consistent with the man who had manipulated Sophie for months, calculating, cold, and ultimately indifferent to the pain he had caused. But it wasn't just the evidence that sealed his fate, it was his own arrogance. During a critical moment in the trial, Cole slipped up, revealing the exact details of Sophie's final moments, details that had only been known to the police. His inability to keep up the facade of innocence was his downfall. The prosecution seized upon this, presenting it as the final piece of the puzzle. Cole had known too much. He had orchestrated Sophie's murder, and his lies were falling apart. The jury deliberated for just under a week, but it wasn't long before they returned with a verdict. Guilty. Sophie Rodriguez was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The relief felt by Sophie's family was mixed with the bitter knowledge that nothing could bring her back. They had sought justice, and they had found it, but at what cost? In the months that followed, Sophie's family struggled to rebuild their lives without her. They were left to process not only the loss of their mother and grandmother, but also the emotional devastation of having been betrayed by someone they had trusted. Sophie's children, in particular, found it hard to move forward. They had lost their mother in a cruel and senseless way, and the emotional scars ran deep. But they slowly began to heal, finding solace in each other and in the memories of the mother they had known before Cole had come into her life. Sophie's children also became outspoken advocates for others in vulnerable relationships. They began speaking at domestic violence and financial abuse awareness events, hoping to share their mother's story as a cautionary tale. They wanted to make sure that no one else would fall victim to someone like Cole. As for Cole, he faced his time behind bars without any indication that he truly understood the gravity of what he had done. His actions had been driven by greed and a need for control, and even in prison, he remained a figure of calculated detachment. His only regret seemed to be that he had been caught. Sophie's family, despite the legal victory, found little comfort in the conviction. The pain of losing Sophie, someone who had built a successful life, only to have it torn apart by someone so deceitful, was a wound that would never truly heal. They took small steps forward, but the shadow of her death would always be a part of their lives. And so, the case of Sophie and Cole Rodriguez ended, but the lessons it left behind were profound. What happened to Sophie serves as a reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind a charming face and a well-crafted lie. It is a stark warning about the vulnerability of those who seek love, companionship, or financial security late in life. For Sophie, her fatal mistake was placing her trust in a man who had no intention of loving her, only using her. Her death was not just a personal tragedy. It was a cautionary tale for anyone who may find themselves in a relationship where love and manipulation blur the lines. The story of Sophie Rodriguez is one of loss, betrayal, and the harsh reality that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who can hurt us the deepest. As for her family, they will forever carry her memory, not as a victim, but as a woman who worked tirelessly to create a life she could be proud of. They will continue to fight for justice, hoping that Sophie's story will be remembered not just as a tragedy, but as a warning. As we reflect on Sophie's tragic story, we can't help but wonder, do you think Sophie should have seen the signs, or was Cole's manipulation simply too convincing? What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe there's always a warning when someone is being manipulated, or does love sometimes cloud our judgment? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story chilling and eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell to stay updated on more true crime stories. Your support helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into the darkness of human nature. Thank you for watching.